Rosalie Bennett didn't flinch when Margaret Harlan's fingers closed around her wrist and stopped her cold in front of every woman in Clover Ridge. She didn't cry when the laughter started sharp and bright as breaking glass. She just stood there holding that heavy dark loaf against her chest, like it was the last thing her mother ever gave her. Because it was. If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale travels. The Summer Provision Fair came to Clover Ridge every July like a debt that couldn't be avoided. Loud, crowded, and cruel in ways that polite people pretended not to notice. The community hall smelled of pine resin and heat, and the sweet white loaves that the ranch wives had been baking since dawn, each one more perfect than the last. Ribbons and hand-embroidered cloths decorated the long judging table. The women who arranged them had been arranging things in this town their entire lives, and they knew exactly how the arrangement was supposed to look. There was no space in that arrangement for Rosalie Bennett. Rosie was 25 years old, with thick chestnut hair that never quite stayed pinned and gray-blue eyes that saw more than most people wanted her to see. Her face was young and pretty in a way that surprised people who hadn't been looking for it. Her smile, when she allowed it, was the kind that changed the temperature of a room. But Rosie was a large woman, not merely full-figured, not simply broad-shouldered, the way ranch women sometimes grew. She was genuinely, substantially fat, soft and round, and carrying close to 260 pounds on a frame that moved with more grace than the town had ever given her credit for. Clover Ridge had opinions about that. Clover Ridge had opinions about everything. She had walked 3 miles from her property that morning, in the brutal July heat, the loaf wrapped in her mother's faded linen cloth and tucked under her arm. The bread was dark rye sourdough, dense and fragrant, the kind of bread that didn't look fashionable, but fed a working man for 2 days without spoiling. She had baked it from a starter her mother kept alive for 11 years. She had nurtured that starter through her father's illness, through the funeral, through 2 bad winters, and now through the worst drought that Montana Territory had seen since anyone could remember. The prize money was $40. $40 would repair the iron pump mechanism on her family's deep well before the summer killed what remained of her livestock. Rosie did not enter the competition because she expected to win. She entered because she needed to try. She had barely crossed the threshold of the community hall when Margaret Harlan stepped directly into her path. Margaret was 53 years old and had been the undisputed social authority of Clover Ridge for 2 decades. Her husband owned the largest cattle operation in the valley. Her opinion was the first opinion consulted and the last one questioned. She wore her gray hair in a stiff, elaborate arrangement and carried herself with the particular rigidity of a woman who had decided long ago that softness was a form of weakness. She looked at the wrapped loaf in Rosie's arms. Then she looked at Rosie's body. Her expression did not change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Miss Bennett?" Margaret's voice was pleasant, the way a door closing in your face was pleasant technically without force, but completely final. "The fair table is for contributions from established households." Rosie met her eyes steadily. "My household is established, Mrs. Harlan. I've run the Bennett farm and bakery on my own for 3 years. Margaret tilted her head. "The fair is also meant to reflect a certain standard of—" She paused, letting the pause do what she didn't want to say directly, household discipline, an example for younger women in the community. Behind Margaret, 2 of her closest companions, Clara Finch and Dora Prescott, pressed their lips together in expressions that were trying very hard not to become smiles. Rosie's jaw tightened. She understood every word Margaret hadn't said. She had been understanding those words her entire life. "My bread is made from drought-resistant rye," Rosie said quietly, because she had learned that quiet was harder to dismiss than anger. "It uses half the water of a white wheat loaf. It stays edible longer in the summer heat. The families in the South Quarter." She paused. "The ones whose wells ran dry in June, they've been buying it from me twice a week." Margaret glanced at the loaf again with an expression of faint distaste. "Dark bread," she said, as though that settled the matter entirely. "Yes, ma'am, dark bread." "We don't generally—" Margaret began. "You don't generally allow it." Rosie kept her voice level. "I know." She moved to step around Margaret toward the judging table. Margaret shifted sideways, deliberately blocking her. It was such a small movement. No one who hadn't been watching for it would have noticed. But the women standing nearby noticed, and they understood what it meant, and not one of them said a word. "The judges have already reviewed the entries," Margaret said calmly. "I'm afraid the table is full, Miss Bennett. Perhaps next year, when you've had more time to refine your approach." Clara Finch laughed a bright, breathless sound that she quickly converted into a cough. Dora Prescott looked at the floor. The boy standing 3 feet away had been staring at the wrapped loaf in Rosie's arms for the past 2 minutes. He was perhaps 9 years old, painfully thin, with the careful stillness of a child who had learned not to ask for things. His mother noticed Rosie noticing him and immediately put her hand on his shoulder, steering him away. The mother's eyes didn't meet Rosie's. There was apology in them and shame, but she couldn't afford to cross Margaret Harlan on a public day. Nobody could afford that. Rosie stood completely still for a long moment. The hall continued its noise around her women, talking children running the scrape of chairs on wooden floors. The air pressed down with July heat, and the smell of good expensive food that most of the families at the fair couldn't actually afford to bake. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision before she left her house that morning, the same way she made it every time she came into town. Crying was private. Crying was for the 3-mile walk home. She turned to leave. "Well," said a voice she didn't recognize, low and unhurried, coming from somewhere behind her left shoulder. "If the table's full, I suppose I'll have to make my own arrangements." Rosie turned. He was leaning in the open doorway, one shoulder against the frame, in a posture that suggested he had arrived recently and spent exactly enough time observing the situation to understand what was happening. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from years of physical work, rather than deliberate effort. His skin was deeply tanned from a summer spent in the open, and he had dark brown hair going slightly long beneath the brim of a battered hat that he hadn't removed because he hadn't decided yet whether he was staying. Dust covered his boots from a long ride. There was a quality to his stillness, the stillness of a man who had learned to read a situation before he moved inside it, that made the crowded hall feel briefly oddly quieter. Rosie had never seen him before. She was certain of that. He pushed off the doorframe and walked through the crowd with the particular ease of a man who assumed people would move not out of arrogance, but because they generally did. He stopped in front of Rosie and held out his hand. "May I?" He nodded at the loaf. Rosie stared at him. "I beg your pardon." "The bread." His voice was measured neither warm nor cold, just level. "May I take a look at it?" She had no idea what he intended to do with it. She handed it to him anyway, mostly because she was too surprised not to. He unwrapped the linen cloth with the care of someone who understood that the cloth mattered as much as the bread, folded it once, and placed it over her arm. Then he examined the loaf the way a man examined a horse he was genuinely considering turning it, pressing the crust lightly, bringing it briefly close to assess the smell. Then he tore off a section with both hands and ate it. The hall did not go silent, but the cluster of women nearest to them stopped talking, and that silence spread in a slow ripple outward. He chewed thoughtfully, swallowed, tore off another piece. "How long will it keep?" he asked Rosie. Not Margaret, not the room, Rosie. 5 days in summer heat, she said, watching him carefully. 7 if you wrap it right. And the starter. He tore another piece. "How old is it?" She felt something strange happen in her chest, some pressure she hadn't been aware of beginning to loosen, though she didn't trust it yet. 11 years. My mother's. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He looked at the remainder of the loaf, then at Margaret Harlan. "This is the one I want," he said. Margaret's voice was perfectly controlled. "The judging table is full. Mr. Cole." He didn't look away from the loaf. "Nathaniel Cole. And I didn't say I wanted it judged." He reached into his coat, produced a handful of coins, and placed them on the nearest end of the judging table, with a sound that was not loud, but was somehow definitive. "I said I want it." He looked directly at Rosie. "That's the one I'm taking home. The double meaning hit the room like a stone dropped in still water. Rosie felt the ripple move through every woman standing within 20 feet of them. She saw Margaret's chin lift a fraction of an inch. She saw Clara Finch's eyes widen. She heard from somewhere in the middle distance a sharp inhale that might have been Dora Prescott, and she felt her face go hot, not with pleasure, not yet, not with anything so simple as that, but with a complicated, unwelcome heat that mixed embarrassment and anger, and something she refused to identify and pushed down hard. "Sir." Her voice came out steady, which was the only victory available to her at that exact moment. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I did not ask for a performance on my behalf." He turned to look at her fully for the first time. His eyes were dark, direct, and entirely serious. "No, ma'am," he said. "You didn't. But I'm hungry, and this is the best bread I've tasted in 3 states, and I don't particularly care what a judging table thinks about that." A pause. "Do you have more?" She blinked. Yes. I brought 4 loaves. I'll take all of them." "You—" She stopped, started again. "You don't need 4 loaves. Got 8 ranch hands who've been eating salt pork for 2 weeks, he said. They'll disagree with you." She looked at him for a long moment, this dusty, unhurried stranger who had walked into the summer provision fair and done the one thing no one in Clover Ridge had thought to do, which was simply eat her bread and say it was good. She didn't trust it. She was not built to trust easy gestures from men she didn't know. But her pride was already in pieces on the floor of this community hall, and $40 was $40, and she had a pump that needed fixing before August came. 40 cents per loaf, she said. Done. He produced coins without hesitation. Then he picked up the unwrapped loaf and the remaining 3 from the basket she was carrying, tucked them under his arm, and turned to leave. He paused at the doorway and looked back at the room. His gaze moved across the judging table, across Margaret Harlan's composed expression, across the watching faces, and settled briefly on the thin boy whose mother had pulled him away from the bread. He walked back to the boy, broke off a large piece of the purchased loaf, and held it out. The boy looked at his mother. The mother looked at Nathaniel Cole. Something in his expression, not challenging, just steady, seemed to tell her that no social complication would follow from allowing her child to eat. She gave a small nod. The boy took the bread with both hands and ate it with the focused seriousness of someone who hasn't eaten enough. Nate distributed the remainder among 3 other families on his way out the door. By the time he stepped back into the July heat, every loaf Rosie had brought was gone. She followed him outside because she didn't know what else to do, and because something in her chest was coiling into anger that needed somewhere to go. She found him beside the livery, checking a cinch on a horse that had clearly been ridden hard recently. "Mr. Cole?" He turned. "What you did in there," she said carefully, "was not what you think it was." He waited. "You walked into that hall," she continued, "and you turned my humiliation into a spectacle. And maybe you meant it kindly. Maybe you didn't mean anything at all. But those women will talk about what happened today for the next 3 weeks, and none of that talk will be about how good the bread was." He was quiet for a moment. The horse shifted its weight. In the distance, someone was hammering something, the repetitive, purposeful sound of summer work. "You're right," he said finally. She had been prepared for several responses. That wasn't one of them. "I didn't think past buying the bread," he said. "I thought it was a simple transaction, and I was wrong. I'm sorry for embarrassing you." She studied him. "But not for buying it." "No." A small pause. "Not for that." Against everything she intended, she felt the corner of her mouth move. She stopped it before it became anything. "The 8 ranch hands who needed bread, where are they?" "East Camp, about 4 miles. He straightened. "Where's your spread?" "North Quarter, 3 miles past the ridge." She paused. "Why?" "Because your well is the deepest in the valley, and the summer isn't halfway done." He said it the same way he said everything, without particular drama, as though he was simply noting a fact he thought she should consider. I've driven cattle through 6 drought seasons. I know what a deep well means to a piece of land before August arrives." "Everyone knows what my well means," Rosie said. There was an edge in it that she didn't entirely bother to conceal. He looked at her. "And who's protecting it?" The question arrived without warning and found something unguarded in her, something she had been working hard to keep out of her face ever since she woke up that morning. "I am," she said. He nodded as though that was exactly the answer he expected, and as though he was still deciding what he thought about it. "Nathaniel Cole." He extended his hand properly this time with a formality that seemed genuine rather than performed. "I manage the trail crew for the Hendricks Consortium. Brought a herd through from Wyoming." She shook it. His grip was firm and unsurprised, the grip of a man who had shaken women's hands before and saw nothing unusual about it. "Rosalie Bennett. I run the Bennett Farm and Bakery." Alone. Alone. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, she had seen pity enough times to recognize it from the next county. This was something else, something closer to consideration. "The bread," he said. "What do you make from a batch?" "I clear about 12 cents after flour and firewood." She watched him do the arithmetic. "I know," she added dryly. "It's not a fortune. But you're feeding people who'd otherwise go hungry." "That's not a business model," she said. "That's a problem." He almost smiled. She saw it, the corner of his mouth brief and quickly disciplined, and filed it away without reacting. They stood without speaking for a moment. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. That surprised her more than anything else that had happened so far. "I should get back," she said. "You should." He settled his hat. "Miss Bennett." She turned back. "I meant what I said, about the bread. Not the rest of it, just the bread." Rosie held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, turned and walked north toward home, her mother's empty linen cloth folded over her arm and the July heat pressing against her back like a hand. She didn't let herself think about anything except the pump. The pump was what mattered. The pump and the well and the 3 weeks she had left before the water level dropped below what her cattle needed. She was 300 yards from the community hall when she heard a horse fall into step somewhere behind her. Not following, just going the same direction, which happened on a single road leading out of town to be north. She didn't turn around. She reached the farm at midday. The house needed paint. The fence along the east pasture had a section that had been leaning since April, and she hadn't had time to address it. But the kitchen was clean. The starter sat healthy and fragrant on its shelf. And the well, her father's well, dug by hand through solid rock, over the course of 2 brutal summers, sat deep and quiet and reliable in the yard. She went to the pump first, the way she always did. The handle was wrong. She felt it before she saw it, the way it moved under her hand when it shouldn't have moved, a small metallic wrongness that her body registered before her mind identified it. She pumped twice, got water pumped again. The handle shifted on its housing in a way that meant the bolts had been loosened. Not worn loose. Loosened. She went to her knees in the dirt and looked at the base of the pump. The bolts were backed out by hand, she could tell by the lack of tool marks on the heads, the clean threads. Someone had done it carefully. Someone who knew what they were doing and how long it would take to be noticed. She sat back on her heels. The July sun hit the top of her head like a judgment. In the west, the sky had the bleached, colorless look it got when the heat was building toward something worse. She had 2 wrenches in the barn. She could tighten the bolts herself. She could probably keep the pump operational for another 2 weeks before the mechanism needed replacing entirely. The replacement part had to come from Billings. It cost $11. She did not have $11. She sat in the dirt beside her dead father's well, with her hands loose in her lap, and she allowed herself exactly 45 seconds of something that was not quite despair, something smaller and more specific. The feeling of watching a problem you've been managing carefully begin to exceed your management. And then she stood up because there was nothing else to do. She was on her way to the barn for the wrenches when she heard a horse stop at her gate. She turned. Nathaniel Cole sat his horse at the edge of her property and looked at the pump with the focused attention of a man who recognized the particular posture of someone who had just discovered a problem they weren't prepared to announce. "Something's wrong with the pump," he said. It wasn't a question. She crossed her arms. "What are you doing at my gate, Mr. Cole?" "Going north." He nodded up the road. "Camp's another mile past your property. Thought I'd check the route. You know perfectly well which road goes north." He didn't answer that directly. He looked at the pump again. "Loose housing." She pressed her lips together. Then, because lying about it was pointless, and because he had already seen her face, bolts backed out, by hand. A silence. "When?" "Sometime between last night and this morning." He dismounted. Not rushing, not making a production of it, just got off the horse with the economy of movement that seemed to characterize everything he did, looped the reins around the gatepost, and walked across her yard toward the pump without asking permission. She watched him crouch beside it, examine the housing, check the bolts with his fingers. "You have a half-inch wrench?" he asked. "I was just going for them." "I'll get them if you tell me where." "I'll get them myself," she said. "You can stay or go. Your business." She went to the barn. She came back with both wrenches. He was still crouched by the pump, and he'd produced a small tool of his own, a pair of narrow-nose pliers, and was examining the interior of the housing. "This wasn't a loose bolt," he said without looking up. "Someone filed this thread. Just enough. You'd have lost the mechanism in about a week." Rosie went very still. "That's not vandalism," she said carefully. "That's deliberate." "Yes, ma'am." He sat back on his heels and looked up at her, and there was nothing casual in his expression anymore. "It is." She handed him the wrench without speaking. He tightened what could be tightened and showed her the damage that couldn't be fixed without a replacement part. They worked beside each other in the dirt of the yard, while the sun moved overhead, and neither of them spoke except about the work, the angle, the torque, the depth of the thread damage, the temporary fix they could manage against the permanent repair she couldn't yet afford. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was functional. The way two people who understood the same type of work fell into a rhythm together without needing to explain themselves. When the pump was stable, he stood and handed back her wrench. "You said everyone knows what your well is worth," he said. "Who knows it the most?" Rosie thought of Silas Whitmore's eyes on her property the last time he visited. The careful way he had looked at the well before he looked at her. "I have a suspicion," she said. "A suspicion isn't the same as proof." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her for a long moment. The late afternoon light was doing something complicated to the dust hanging in the air between them, and the heat had dropped a few degrees with the turning of the day, and Rosie was acutely aware that she was standing in her own yard in a work dress with dirt on her knees and her hair falling down from its pins, and a man she had met 4 hours ago was looking at her with an attention that had nothing diminishing in it. $11, she said abruptly. "That's the part. If I'm in Billings by Thursday, I can have it back before Sunday. I can cover." "No." She said it cleanly, without anger. "Thank you, but no." He accepted this without argument, which she noted. "Is there something else you can sell?" he asked. Not pushing, not solving, just asking. "I have 60 pounds of finished bread and a new batch of dried biscuits." She paused. "And I can bake through the night if I have orders." "You have orders," he said. She looked at him. 8 ranch hands," he said. 4 miles east. And I'll send word to the Kinney outfit south of the ridge they've been rotating through Billings flour, and they'd rather not." He paused. "If the price is fair." "The price is always fair," she said. "That's half the problem." Something shifted in his expression. A brightness quick and unguarded there, and then managed. "What's the other half? People who can afford to pay don't believe something can be worth buying if a woman baked it." She held his gaze. "Or if the woman who baked it looks like me." He didn't look away from that. He didn't offer reassurance, or argue with it, or smooth it over with a compliment, all of which were the things men usually did when a woman said something true and uncomfortable. He just held her gaze and let the honesty of it sit between them. "Well," he said finally, "I just paid 40 cents per loaf, and I'd have gone to 60. Rosie said nothing. "Good bread's good bread," he said. "Same as a good well's a good well. The rest is just people deciding what they're allowed to want." She was quiet for a moment that stretched further than she'd intended. "You'd better be getting to your camp, Mr. Cole." "Yes, ma'am." He collected his hat from the fence post where he'd set it, settled it back, and moved toward his horse. At the gate, he stopped. "Miss Bennett, do you have a lock for the pump housing?" "No." "I'll bring one tomorrow." He said it matter-of-factly, without offering it as anything more than it was a practical solution to a practical problem. "When I come for the bread." She opened her mouth to say something deflecting, and found to her own surprise that she didn't. "Sunrise," she said. "I'll have it ready." He nodded once mounted, and rode north without looking back. Rosie stood at her gate in the long light of the summer evening, watching him go. The pump dripped quietly behind her. The starter was growing on the kitchen shelf. The bread she would bake tonight would feed men she'd never met, and tomorrow there would be money for the part, and the well would survive August, and none of it had gone the way the morning was supposed to go. She turned back toward the house. There was flour to measure and firewood to lay in, and a full night's work ahead of her. She did not allow herself to think about the way he had looked at her pump damage, and said, "That's deliberate, not with alarm, not with the paternalistic urgency of a man assembling a reason to take over, but with the level matter-of-fact gravity of someone who thought she needed accurate information rather than protection from it." She did not think about that. She went inside and started the fire and began to work. She was 3 hours into baking when she heard the sound, not from outside, not from the yard, but from the road. A horse moving at a walk south to north and then stopping, then moving again. She went to the window. Nothing in the darkness. The road was empty. But in the morning, when she went to the pump at first light, there was a new lock already fitted to the housing. Iron solid, the kind that cost $4 in town. And beside the pump, planted in the dirt, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had taken their time, a small bundle of dried sage tied with a strip of leather. Rosie stared at it for a long time. Then she picked it up, took it inside, and put it on the shelf next to her mother's starter. She did not examine what she felt about it. She put it on the shelf and went back to finish the bread. Some things could wait until there was more time to understand them. The well was holding. The pump was locked. The bread was baking. That was enough for one morning. The bread sold out before 8 o'clock in the morning. Nate arrived at sunrise exactly as promised, with 2 of his ranch hands trailing behind him and an empty wagon that had no business being empty by the time it left her property. Rosie had baked through the night 6 full loaves, 4 batches of dried biscuits, a round of cornbread that she'd added at 3 in the morning, because the fire was still good, and she couldn't sleep anyway. She had it all wrapped and stacked on the porch table when the wagon rolled up, and she watched Nate's men load it with the efficient, unhurried competence of people who did physical work for a living and respected it in others. Nate counted out the money on her porch railing without being asked, exact to the penny. Then he added $4 extra and set them separately. Rosie looked at them. "What's that for?" "Night work," he said. "You bake through the dark. That's worth more than daylight flour." She picked up her earnings and left the extra $4 on the railing. "The price I quoted is the price I charge." He looked at the $4, then he picked them up and put them back in his coat without argument. She noticed he didn't look offended. He looked like a man filing information away for later. "The Kinney outfit," he said. "I sent word last night. They want to know if you can supply trail bread for a drive leaving in 3 weeks. 20 men, 10 days. Rosie did the arithmetic in her head before he finished the sentence. "That's 140 loaves minimum. Can you do it?" She thought about the flour supply, the firewood, the starter, the well, the one functioning oven, the fact that she had not slept in 22 hours and was currently calculating production capacity on a porch in the early light with dirt under her fingernails and a stranger watching her think. "Yes," she said. He nodded once as though he'd expected that answer. "I'll confirm it this afternoon." She wanted to ask him why he was doing this. The lock, the sage, the business connections, the early morning wagon, She wanted to understand the accounting of it, what he expected in return, because in her experience, nothing arrived without a bill attached somewhere. But she was tired, and the money was in her hand, and the pump was locked, and the well was holding. And she had learned the hard way that demanding explanations from a situation while it was still working in your favor was a good way to stop the situation from working in your favor. So she said, "Thank you, Mr. Cole." And he said, "Miss Bennett." And the wagon rolled south, and she went inside to sleep for 3 hours before starting the next batch. She woke up to the sound of hammering. She lay still for a moment listening, deciding whether to be alarmed. The hammering was coming from the east pasture. Methodical measured the sound of someone who knew what they were doing. She got up, looked out the window, and saw Nate Cole replacing the leaning section of fence she hadn't had time to fix since April. She went outside. He had his coat off, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was working alone the post hole digger and a stack of new timber beside him in the grass. "I didn't ask for that," she said. He didn't stop working. "No, ma'am, you didn't." "Then what exactly are you doing?" "Fixing a fence." He set another post. "The Kinney Drive is going to pass north of your property in 3 weeks. Your east line's leaning. Cattle drift through weak fencing, and then you've got a mixing problem and a legal argument." He tamped the post. "I'm preventing a future inconvenience." She stared at him. "For the cattle drive?" "Partly." She crossed her arms. "What's the other part?" He stopped working then and looked at her directly, with that steadiness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things, not performing seriousness, just genuinely serious. "The other part is that someone deliberately filed the thread on your pump housing, and I'd rather they find this property harder to damage than they're expecting." The clarity of it hit her like cold water. She had been telling herself the pump was isolated, a single incident, possibly opportunistic. Hearing him say it plainly, someone deliberately, your property made it real in a way she'd been resisting. "You think it'll happen again?" she said. "I think it already happened once, and nobody in that town hall yesterday seemed particularly concerned about it." He went back to work. "So, yes." Rosie sat down on the fence rail he hadn't replaced yet and watched him work. She didn't offer to help because the work was physical and the posts were heavy, and she was practical enough to know where her contribution was useful and where it wasn't. But she didn't go back inside either. "Silas Whitmore," she said. He didn't react to the name, which told her he already knew it. "He came to the house 2 weeks ago," she continued. "Offered to cancel my land note, repair the well, and provide for my household if I married him. He made it sound like charity." She paused. "He looked at the well 3 times during that conversation. He didn't look at me once." "What does he own?" "The general store, the grain storage, the freight contract from Billings." She paused. "And as of last month, I'm told he purchased 4 delinquent land notes from the county assessor. Mine wasn't one of them, not yet." Nate set another post. "But it could be." "If I miss the August payment, yes." The hammering continued. 2 fence posts, 3 the line of the east boundary growing solid and straight where it had been leaning and uncertain. "He controls the freight," Nate said, "which means he controls what comes in and what goes out." "He's been refusing to stock my rye flour for 6 weeks, Rosie said. "I've been sourcing it direct from a mill in Billings at twice the transport cost. That's why the margin is what it is." Nate was quiet for a moment. "That's not business friction," he said. "That's a squeeze." "I know what it is." She looked at her hands. "The question is, what to do about it." He set the last post in the section and straightened. "The Kinney Drive contract," he said. "If you can fulfill it, that's enough money to cover your August payment and order 6 months of flour direct." He looked at her. "Whitmore can't control freight contracts between private parties." Rosie looked at him. "How do you know what my August payment is?" A pause. Brief but real. "I don't. I'm estimating from what trailbred contracts generally run and what a land note on a property this size likely costs." "That's a very precise estimate." "I've managed money for a cattle consortium for 8 years, he said. "I estimate things." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable for either of them. And then she let it go, because the estimate was correct and the plan was sound, and she was not in a position to refuse useful arithmetic on principle. "There's still the flour problem," she said. "If I can't get rye from Billings in time, I'm riding to Billings Thursday to settle accounts with the consortium." He said it before she could finish. "Give me your order and I'll bring it back. You pay the mill rate, not the freight markup." Rosie was quiet. "That's too much," she said finally. "It's a 4-hour detour." "That's not what I meant." He looked at her steadily. "I know what you meant." He picked up his coat from the grass. "You meant you don't know what I want in return." The honesty of it stopped her. She nodded. He took his time answering. "I want good bread on a long trail drive," he said. "I want a reliable supplier who understands how cattle work and won't give me white flour biscuits that turn green in the heat." He paused. "And I want to spend time on a piece of property where the person who owns it isn't afraid of the truth." Another pause, shorter this time. "That's all I want, Miss Bennett. You can take it or leave it." She took it. They drew up a simple supply agreement that afternoon on her kitchen table. Her paper, her pen, his careful left-handed print that surprised her. The terms clear and equal and signed by both. She supplied bread and dried goods for the Kinney Drive at the agreed rate. He provided transport fare payment on delivery and the Billings flour run. Neither of them owed the other anything that wasn't written down. When he left, she looked at the agreement for a long time. She had never signed a contract with anyone before. Her father had operated on handshakes, and she had seen what handshakes were worth when there was no one left to shake them. The paper felt important, not because of what it promised, but because of what it assumed that she was a business person worth contracting with, that her word and her work had a value that could be stated plainly and held to. She folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept her father's deed. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He never arrived without a reason. A question about the bread order, a measurement for the shaded rack he was building to cool loaves faster in the summer heat. A piece of information about the Kinney timeline, something practical and specific that gave them both the cover of purpose. But the reasons kept presenting themselves, and he kept appearing, and Rosie was honest enough with herself to understand that neither of them was being entirely fooled by the pretense. On the 4th morning, he arrived with lumber and built the cooling rack in her yard while she baked. It was a good design, she hadn't asked for it, and she wouldn't have designed it quite the same way, and she told him so, and he modified it according to her specifications without discussion, and by noon, it was exactly what she needed. She brought him water from the well. He drank it. They stood in the yard without speaking for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable. "You're not what I expected," she said. He looked at her. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something simpler." She paused. "Most men who help me want something obvious in return. Credit or gratitude or the kind of authority that comes from being needed. And you think I'm after something less obvious." "I think you're after something," she said. "I haven't decided what yet." He set his water cup down on the new rack. "What would it take," he said carefully, "to convince you that a man could find you genuinely worth his time without wanting to own something that belongs to you?" The question was so direct that it caught her off guard, which was clearly his intention. She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never had evidence of it." He nodded as though this was a fair and useful piece of information. "Then I suppose I'll have to be patient." "You may be waiting a long time." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've driven cattle across 600 miles of open country in July heat, Miss Bennett. I've got patience to spare." She almost smiled. She was getting better at stopping it, but he had noticed she could tell by the way he looked carefully in the other direction at the exact moment it almost happened, giving her the privacy of it. On the 6th day, she caught him watching her work. She was managing the oven, transferring loaves with the long peel, and she turned and found him leaning against the kitchen doorframe with his arms crossed, not doing anything useful, just watching her move through the work she'd been doing since she was 12 years old. There was an expression on his face that she couldn't immediately name something attentive and quiet and wholly unguarded, the face of a man who had forgotten for a moment that he was supposed to be presenting one. When he saw her see it, he didn't look away or apologize. He just said, "You're very good at that. At baking. At knowing what you're doing." He paused. "There's a difference." She turned back to the oven because she didn't know what to do with that, and doing nothing with it was better than doing the wrong thing. "Mr. Cole," she said, not turning around, "are you courting me?" A silence. Not the silence of a man caught the silence of a man taking a question seriously. "I'm thinking about it," he said. She set the bread peel against the wall. "That's not an answer. It's an honest one." He uncrossed his arms. "You told me you don't know what I want. I figured I should tell you what I'm considering before you've decided what to make of it." She turned around. He was still in the doorway, not crowding her, not moving forward, just present, solid, offering her the option of the conversation without demanding it. "I don't trust easily," she said. "I know. I especially don't trust men who appear unexpectedly helpful and then turn out to have an agenda that was never about the help. I know that too. And I'm not—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm aware of what I look like, Mr. Cole. I'm aware of what this town thinks of me. I've had men be kind to me in private and thoroughly humiliated me in public, and I've had men be interested in my land and dress it up as interest in me, and I have very little ability left to tell the difference." She held his gaze. "So when I ask you if you're courting me, I'm not being coy. I'm asking you a direct question so that I can make a direct decision." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be deciding to retreat. Men often retreated when she was too direct. It frightened them, or it bored them, or it deflated something in the situation that they'd preferred inflated. "Yes," he said. "I'm courting you, or I'm trying to. I haven't decided if I'm doing it right." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. He thought about it. "Because you walked into that hall carrying something valuable, and the whole room tried to tell you it was worthless, and you didn't believe them." He paused. "I've been looking for a long time for a woman who knew the difference between other people's opinions and the truth. I didn't expect to find her at a bread fair in Clover Ridge." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, something was moving in the cottonwoods along the creek, a breeze, the first real one in days, touching the leaves and settling again. "I need to think about that," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said, and he left her to her thinking and went to check the fence line because there was always something useful to be done, and he was that kind of man. The drought deepened in the second week of July like a hand slowly closing. Families who had been managing began arriving at Rosie's gate with empty jugs and careful faces, the faces of people who were not accustomed to asking for things and had run out of alternatives. Rosie let them draw from the well. She didn't track. It didn't make a ledger of it because charity that came with a record was a different thing from charity. But she tracked the water level. She tracked it carefully. When she told Nate, he didn't tell her to stop. He just asked how long at current draw rate before the level became critical, and she told him 6 weeks, and he said he'd look into the spring on the south ridge that he'd noticed on his way in. She didn't ask him to do that. He just went and did it. He came back 2 days later and told her the spring was running clean, but the channel had been partially blocked, rocks placed, not fallen. He'd cleared it and diverted a quarter of the flow toward the creek that fed her land. "Someone blocked it," she said. "Yes. Recently. Within the month." He looked at her steadily. "The same someone who filed your pump thread." Rosie sat with this. "Silas needs the town to depend on his water barrels," she said slowly. "If the natural sources fail, if my well looks like it's failing, he becomes the only source," Nate said, "and he sets the price. And my well—" She stopped. "If my well is the only reliable source, I'm either an obstacle or an asset to him, depending on whether I cooperate." "Which you won't?" "Which I won't." They looked at each other across her kitchen table with the weight of a situation that was larger than either of them had first understood. "I need proof," she said. "Not suspicion. Proof." "I know." He set his hands flat on the table. I'm working on it. Mr. Cole. She paused. Nate. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and she hadn't planned it. It just arrived and she didn't take it back. This isn't your fight. He looked at her for a moment. That fence I repaired borders property. I'll be driving cattle across in 2 weeks. The spring I cleared feeds water that my cattle drink. And the woman managing this situation is worth protecting. A pause. Pick any one of those reasons, and they're all real. She looked at her hands. I don't want to be protected, she said. I want to be believed. Rosie. He said her name the same way she'd said his, carefully, like something he'd decided on. I believe you. I believed you in the community hall when you explained what the bread was and everyone ignored you. I believed you when you described what Whitmore said and how he said it. His voice was steady and quiet. Believing you and helping you aren't opposite things. She looked up at him. Something behind her sternum was doing something she didn't fully trust, yet warm and dangerous and inconvenient. I'm going to need more time, she said, to trust me. To trust anything good, she said honestly. He nodded. He didn't push. He stood up, collected his hat, and told her he'd have word from the Kinney outfit by Friday. She watched him leave through her kitchen window and then turned back to her bread and her ledger and the careful work of keeping everything she'd built from falling apart. Silas Whitmore came to her property on a Thursday morning unannounced and immaculate, wearing a suit that was inappropriate for the heat and carrying his hat in both hands, in the gesture of a man performing humility he didn't feel. Rosie met him at the gate. She did not invite him in. He was 43, broad-shouldered, but soft in the way of a man whose labor was other people's, with silver-streaked hair and a careful smile that he deployed with the precision of a tool. He was not unpleasant to look at. He was not taken feature by feature an obviously threatening man. That was part of what made him dangerous. Miss Bennett, the careful smile. I've been thinking about our last conversation. I have too, she said. He waited for her to continue. She didn't. I want you to understand, he said, that my offer stands without conditions. I have great respect for what you've built here. His eyes moved briefly and deliberately to the well. This property has extraordinary value. I would consider it a privilege to help you protect it. From what? She asked. He spread his hands gently. From the uncertainties of managing it alone. A drought year is a hard year for a woman without support. I've watched you struggle, Miss Bennett, and it concerns me. I don't recall inviting your concern. His smile didn't falter. Of course not. But a caring community watches out for its members. He paused. My offer is generous. A home security relief from this financial pressure. All I ask in return is the opportunity to care for you properly. And the well, she said. A brief, careful pause. The well comes with the property, of course. Of course. She looked at him. Mr. Whitmore, the last time you visited my pump mechanism had been deliberately damaged. The spring south of the ridge had been intentionally blocked, and you've been refusing to stock my flour for 6 weeks through the supply channel you control. She kept her voice perfectly even. I don't need a caring community member. I need those things to stop. Something moved behind his eyes. It was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was the calculation of a man reassessing a situation that wasn't going as planned. Those are serious allegations, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. They are. Without proof, they're also dangerous ones. He said it gently, pleasantly, as though warning her for her own good. A woman in your position, Miss Bennett, without family, without legal standing, making accusations against a respected man of business. He shook his head with apparent concern. It could go very badly for you. Is that a threat, Mr. Whitmore? It's advice, he said, from someone who wishes you well. The smile again warm as a closed door. Think carefully about what you want your future to look like. My offer has a timeline. After the August assessment, the options available to you become significantly more limited. He replaced his hat, nodded with perfect courtesy, and walked back to his wagon. Rosie stood at her gate and watched him drive away and felt the particular cold anger of someone who has just been threatened by someone who will never admit that's what happened. She went inside and wrote down everything he had said, word for word, before the precision of it faded. She didn't tell Nate about the visit immediately. She told him 3 days later when she'd had time to decide what she wanted to do with the information rather than just how she felt about it. She didn't want comfort. She wanted a plan. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He mentioned the August assessment specifically," he said. "Yes, which means he knows the exact date of your note payment and the exact amount." He paused. "That's not public information." Rosie had already noticed this. He bought other delinquent notes from the county assessor, which means he has a relationship with someone in the assessor's office who has access to all outstanding notes in the county. Yes. She looked at him. "He's not just doing this to me." "No," Nate said. "He's not." The weight of that settled over them both. Rosie had understood her own situation clearly. Understanding that it was a pattern, that there were other properties, other notes, other wells, was something larger and colder. "I need to talk to the other families," she said. "The ones whose notes he's holding." "That's risky," Nate said. "If he finds out you're organizing, I'm already at risk," she said. "Standing still is just a slower way of losing." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" She appreciated that he asked it that way. Not what he could do. What she needed. "Your trail contacts," she said. "You know every outfit moving cattle through this territory. If Whitmore is controlling freight and water for a wider area, someone in those outfits has felt it." She paused. "I need names, and I need someone Whitmore doesn't know to ask the questions." "Done," he said. "And I need the Kinney contract settled before August," she said. "Whatever happens, I need that money in hand." "Done." She nodded. Then she looked at the supply agreement in her tin box and thought about what it meant, the paper, the signatures, the assumption that she was a person whose word could be contracted with. "Nate," she said. He looked up. "When the Kinney drive is done and the note is paid and Whitmore has been dealt with..." She stopped. "Yes," he said. "I'd like to revisit the conversation we started in this kitchen," she said. "The one about what you're considering." He was very still. "I'm not saying yes to anything," she said clearly. "I'm saying I'd like the conversation. Under my terms. When I'm not fighting for my land on 3 fronts simultaneously." "Under your terms," he repeated. "Yes." "All right." He held her gaze. "I'll be here." She believed him. That was the most frightening part. Standing in her kitchen with bread in the oven and a fight coming and a man looking at her like she was the most interesting problem he'd ever had the good fortune to encounter. She believed him. Outside, the summer heat was building again. The drought wasn't done. Whitmore wasn't done. The well water was dropping a slow inch every week, and the August deadline was 22 days away, and everything was still dangerously, exhaustingly uncertain. But the bread was good. The contract was signed. The pump was locked. And for the first time since her parents died, Rosalie Bennett did not feel entirely alone inside the uncertainty. She turned back to her oven. There was work to do. The flour arrived from Billings on a Friday, 2 days before Nate had promised it. He brought it himself, driving a borrowed freight wagon with 200 pounds of dark rye stacked in the bed. And when Rosie came out of the house and saw the quantity, she stopped walking and did the math in her head twice, because the first calculation seemed wrong. "That's double the order," she said. Mill gave a bulk rate. He climbed down from the wagon. "I covered the difference. You can pay me back when the Kinney contract settles." "Nate?" "It's a loan," he said. "Written terms, fair interest, same as any bank." He looked at her steadily. "A bank would have charged you more and taken 3 weeks." She looked at the flour, then at him. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll write it up." They drafted the loan agreement at her kitchen table in 10 minutes, and he signed it without reading it twice, because he'd already done his reading while she wrote. She noticed that. She noticed everything he did now, cataloged it against the index of men she'd known before, and kept finding that it didn't match. That bothered her more than she expected. It was easier to manage people when they behaved predictably. She was putting the signed paper in the tin box when he said, "I found one of them." She turned. "One of Whitmore's men," he said. "Former. He was let go in May, some argument over wages. He's been working day labor for the Kinney outfit." He paused. "His name is Percy Drum. He loaded the pump mechanism himself. He said Whitmore gave him $4 and told him it was a maintenance adjustment the owner had requested." Rosie sat down slowly. "He didn't know." "He didn't know then. He does now." Nate set his hat on the table. "He also knows about the spring blockage, the flour freight refusals, and 3 other properties where Whitmore arranged similar maintenance adjustments that somehow never got fixed." The cold anger was back, spreading up from somewhere in her chest. 3 other properties. The Halverson widow on the East Ridge, the Murtaugh brothers who run sheep on the South Flats, and old Emmett Price who owns the creek rights upstream from Whitmore's storage tanks. He paused. All of them missed land note payments in the last 8 months. All of them sold or abandoned their properties under pressure. He let that sit for a moment. Whitmore bought every one of those notes through the assessor's office. Same man every time. Assessor's clerk named Grover Hines. Rosie was very still. "He's been running this for years." "Looks like it. And Percy Drum will testify to this." "He will." Nate's voice was measured. "For the right protection. He's scared, Rosie. He knows what Whitmore does to problems." She looked at the tin box where she kept the deed, the contracts, her father's will. "We need the territorial marshal. I've already sent a wire from Billings." He held her gaze. "Marshal Holt is 3 days out. He's coming on another matter, but he'll hear this when he arrives." For a moment, she couldn't speak. She had been carrying the weight of this for weeks, the certainty that something was wrong, the inability to prove it, the exhausting work of managing her own fear alongside everything else. And hearing that the mechanism of justice was actually in motion was almost too much to process standing up. "You did all of this," she said carefully, "without telling me." He heard the edge in it. "I was gathering information. I didn't want to give you half a story." "That's not your decision to make." "You're right." He didn't flinch from it. "I should have told you what I was looking for before I went looking. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long time. The apology was real. She'd gotten good at detecting the difference. But the irritation was also real, and both things were true at once. "Don't do it again," she said. "I won't." "I mean it, Nate. Whatever happens between us, if anything happens, I need to be inside the decisions that affect my property and my life, not informed afterward." "Understood." He held her gaze without qualification. "Fully." She nodded, picked up her pen. "Tell me everything Percy Drum said. Start from the beginning." She spent the next 2 days baking. Not because she could ignore what was coming, but because the bread needed to be done, and the Kinney contract needed to be fulfilled, and the August payment was 16 days away, and all of those things existed regardless of Silas Whitmore and his schemes. The work was real. The work was what she could control. She recruited 2 women from the South Quarter. Ada Morse, who was a widow with good hands and 3 children to feed, and Lena Grabowski, an immigrant wife whose husband worked seasonal labor, and who had been quietly buying Rosie's bread at a discount for months because she couldn't always make rent and groceries in the same week. Rosie offered them fair wages and flexible hours and the use of her oven, and both of them accepted without hesitation and showed up the next morning before sunrise. By noon, the 3 of them had produced more bread than Rosie could have managed alone in 2 days. Ada worked fast and talked while she worked, which Rosie had always done herself, and there was a particular ease in working alongside women who treated the kitchen like a serious place rather than a decorative one. Lena was quieter, but precise, with a feel for dough that came from somewhere deep and practiced, and she made suggestions about timing, about the fire temperature, about a braided technique for the biscuit dough that genuinely improved the result. At midday, when they sat together with water from the well and bread heels and a little dried meat, Ada said, "You know what Whitmore told my husband last spring? He told him the only reason I still had the lease on our property was because Whitmore personally vouched for us with the assessor." Rosie looked at her. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Ada said. "I thought he was being neighborly." She tore a piece of bread. "Now I think he was telling us something else entirely." "He was telling you that you owed him," Rosie said. "Yes." Ada was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he did the same to the others? The Halverson woman, the Murtaugh boys?" "I think it's exactly what he did," Rosie said. Lena was listening carefully. "In Poland," she said slowly, picking her English words with deliberate care. "There was a man in our village who owned the mill. He set the price for grinding grain. If you didn't pay what he asked, your flour was always the last to be milled, and sometimes it was accidentally spoiled." She paused. "He was a respected man. The priest liked him. The mayor owed him money." She looked at Rosie. It took a bad harvest and a dead woman before anyone said the truth out loud. The kitchen was very quiet. "No one is dying on my property," Rosie said. "No," Lena said simply. "We will make sure of that." It was not a dramatic declaration. It was a practical statement between three working women who understood exactly what they were talking about, and it meant more to Rosie than any speech she'd heard in the community hall in her entire life. The town council meeting was called 4 days later. Rosie had not been invited. She came anyway. The meeting was held in the community hall, where else it was always the community hall, the same room where Margaret Harlan had blocked her path a month ago, and it was attended by every property owner in Clover Ridge who had received a letter from the council regarding what the agenda described as emergency water resource management. Silas Whitmore sat at the far end of the table from the council chairman in the position of a man who had been consulted rather than summoned. He had prepared documents. He had brought Grover Hines from the assessor's office. He had Rosie noticed arrange the chairs in advance. She walked in with Ada Morse on her left and Lena Grabowski on her right, and the conversation in the room shifted, the way conversation always shifted when Rosie entered a room, a dip, a ripple, the particular attention of people deciding how to react to something they hadn't expected. Margaret Harlan, seated in the third row, watched her come in with an expression that was hard to read. Not hostile, something more complicated than that. Rosie didn't spend time on it. The council chairman, a heavy-set rancher named George Fillmore, who had always been essentially decent, if thoroughly unimaginative, cleared his throat. "Miss Bennett, this meeting is for property holders with—" "I hold property," she said. "The Bennett Farm North Quarter deed, filed 1879. She sat down. Ada and Lena sat on either side of her. Fillmore looked at Whitmore. Whitmore's expression didn't change. "The purpose of this meeting," Whitmore said smoothly, addressing the room rather than responding to Rosie directly, "is to discuss a cooperative management arrangement for the water resources of Clover Ridge during the current drought emergency. Given that the natural springs and shallow wells have failed, the town needs a coordinated supply system." He paused. "I am prepared to offer my storage facilities and freight access for community use at a reasonable administration fee." "What fee?" someone called from the back. "Nothing onerous," Whitmore said pleasantly. "A modest contribution to cover my costs. We can work out the specifics." 20 cents per barrel, Rosie said. The room turned to look at her. "That's what he charged the Halverson widow," she said, "and the Murtaugh brothers, and Emmett Price before they all sold their properties." She reached into her coat and produced the pages she'd spent the previous evening writing out everything Percy Drum had said, organized in clear order with dates and amounts. "He'll tell you this meeting is about helping the community. What he means is that if the town's water supply runs through his storage facility, he controls it. And the price will rise every time someone is desperate enough to pay more." The silence in the room was different now, heavier. "Those are serious allegations," Fillmore said. "Yes." She stood. "The Bennett well is currently the only deep source water in the valley. I have been supplying families from it at no charge because I can, and because it's the right thing to do. I intend to continue doing that. She held the papers up. What I intend to stop is someone systematically damaging the natural sources and the private infrastructure that keeps this town alive, so that people have no choice but to pay him for the alternative. Miss Bennett? Whitmore's voice was measured, careful, doing the thing it always did, the friendly pressure thing. You're an unmarried young woman who has been managing a difficult property alone during a hard season. I understand the stress of that. I don't think anyone would hold it against you if... My well pump mechanism was deliberately filed, she said. The South Ridge spring was intentionally blocked with placed rocks. I have a witness who participated in both actions on your instruction. She looked directly at him. His name is Percy Drum. He worked for you until May. He was paid $4 for the pump and $2 for the spring. The room broke open. Not loudly, not immediately, but in the particular way of a room full of people who have been holding a collective breath, suddenly discovering that breathing is possible again. Questions cross-talk the scrape of chairs, George Fillmore calling for order with diminishing authority. Whitmore's face had not changed. That was the most frightening thing. He was still composed, still pleasant, still watching her with the patience of a man who believed he had more options than she did. A disgruntled former employee, he said calmly when the room quieted, making claims for which there is no documentation, no corroboration. There is corroboration, said a voice from the doorway. Nate walked in. He had ridden hard, she could tell by the state of him, hat gone, coat dusty, and he crossed the room with the focused economy of someone who had places to be, and this was one of them. He placed a folded document on George Fillmore's table. Signed statement from Percy Drum, he said, witnessed and notarized in Billings 2 days ago. He placed a second document beside it. Records from the county assessor's office showing the land notes purchased by Whitmore through Grover Hines in the past 18 months. He placed a third. Freight manifests showing the systematic refusal of rye flour shipments to Bennett Farm, cross-referenced with the date Whitmore made his first property offer. He stepped back. He didn't look at Rosie, not because he was ignoring her, but because he understood that this moment needed to be hers, not his, and he had done what he came to do. Whitmore looked at the documents. For the first time, the pleasantness slipped. Just for a moment, a tightening around the eyes, a fraction of the jaw, and then it was back, but now everyone in the room had seen the thing underneath it. This is a conspiracy, Whitmore said, orchestrated by a woman who wants her property left alone, Rosie said. That's it. That's the whole conspiracy. Margaret Harlan said something then that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She said it quietly, without drama, from her seat in the third row. George, read the documents. Fillmore read them. The meeting did not resolve itself that evening. These things never did. Fillmore agreed to refer the matter to the territorial marshal. Hines, the assessor's clerk, turned gray around the collar and asked twice whether he could leave. Whitmore departed with the composure of a man who had decided the situation required a different approach, and the smile he directed at Rosie on his way out was a new kind of smile, not the friendly pressure kind, but something stripped of pretense entirely. She watched him go and felt no satisfaction, only the recognition that the hardest part was still coming. It came 6 days before the August deadline. Rosie woke before dawn to the smell of smoke. She was dressed and outside in under 2 minutes, and what she saw from her porch was fire moving through the dry grass on the south end of her property, maybe 300 yards out, running fast in the night wind toward the fence line Nate had repaired. She ran for the bakery bell, a salvaged school bell she'd mounted on the barn roof when she first moved back to the farm, because her father had told her that a woman alone needed a way to be heard at a distance, and she pulled the rope 4 times the signal she'd established with Ada and Lena after the council meeting, the one that meant now. Then she ran back for the well. She had 2 buckets and a horse trough and a hand pump, and she knew exactly how much water she could move in how much time, which was not enough. She knew that before the second bucket hit the ground. She filled it anyway and ran. Ada arrived in 8 minutes on her husband's horse with 2 more buckets tied to the saddle. Lena came on foot with a wet blanket. 3 other neighbors' families who'd drawn from the well, families who owed her nothing except the debt of water, materialized out of the dark within 15 minutes. Rosie organized them without raising her voice. This one to the fence line, this one to the trough relay, this one to watch the wind. She had thought about fire since the first week of July, thought about it the way you thought about every disaster that was one dry season away from being real, and that thinking was worth something now. The fire was moving toward the south pasture, and beyond that, toward the poor settlement at the edge of town, a cluster of small homes and a livery, and the schoolhouse where summer classes had been running all week. "The children," Rosie said to Ada. "Already," Ada started. "I need wagons at the schoolhouse, now." Ada turned her horse and went. The fire line was spreading faster than the bucket relay could manage, and Rosie felt the specific cold clarity of understanding a situation is past one kind of response and needs another. She left the relay line to Lena's direction and ran to the fence. The section Nate had built was good timber, solid and close set. She found the weak point, 2 sections north, the original old fence, leaning and dry, and she grabbed the top rail and pulled. The wood was rotted enough to come loose at the 3rd pull, and she dragged 20 feet of it clear of the grass line and stomped it flat, creating a break that the fire couldn't cross without fuel. Her hands were bleeding by the time she finished. She didn't notice until later. She was moving toward the south pasture when she saw Margaret Harlan's granddaughter. The girl was 7 years old. Rosie knew her only as Clara's youngest. A serious child with a red hair ribbon, and she had gotten separated from whoever was supposed to be watching her, and was standing frozen 30 yards from the nearest structure, which was the storage shed at the edge of the schoolyard. And the wind had just shifted and was pushing smoke directly over the shed and through the shed's loose-fitted walls. Margaret was there, standing 50 feet from the child, completely still. The smoke confusion rendering her, for the first time Rosie had ever seen, entirely lost. No composure, no authority, just a woman watching something happen to someone she loved and being unable to move. Rosie moved. She didn't think about it. She went past Margaret without speaking and crossed the yard and went to the girl and took her by the hand and turned toward open air. The smoke hit them both at the same time, thick and hot, dropping fast from the roof level where it had collected. And the girl coughed and went down on one knee, and Rosie picked her up, all 60 pounds of her, and kept walking. She was 8 feet from the door. The smoke was bad, the kind of bad that had a weight to it. She lost the door for a moment, then found the light outside it, gray-pink dawn through the haze, and aimed for that, and her vision was going dark at the edges, and her lungs were doing something that felt like swallowing fire. But she kept moving toward the gray-pink light, and she came through the door and kept going until there was clean air, and then she went down to her knees on the packed earth with the girl in her arms and could not immediately get back up. Margaret was there in an instant. She took the girl with shaking hands and held her against her chest and looked at Rosie kneeling in the dirt with smoke-wet eyes and bleeding hands and said nothing for a long moment. Then Nathaniel Cole came through the smoke at a run. He came in from the south road. She learned later that he'd ridden through the night after receiving a message about the council meeting, that he'd been an hour out when he saw the fire and pushed the horse to its limit. And he came through the smoke on foot. Horse left somewhere behind him, and the first thing he did was go to his knees in the dirt beside Rosie and put both hands on her face. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not fine." He was checking her hands, her face, the state of her breathing. "Can you stand?" "In a minute." "Rosie." "In a minute, Nate." She pulled in a long breath of clean air. "Go help with the fire line." He looked at her for one long moment, the look of a man deciding between what he wanted to do and what she needed him to do, and then he stood up and went to the fire line. She watched him go. The fire was brought under control in another 40 minutes. Not by any single act, but by the accumulated effort of 30 people who had shown up with buckets and blankets, and the specific competence of people who understood that the alternative to working was losing. The fire break Rosie had torn open in the fence line held. The wind shifted back. The schoolhouse stood. When it was over, people stood in the gray smoke smell of early morning and looked at each other and at the scorched grass and at the well that was still running and the bakery that had not burned, and said very little because there was very little to say. Margaret Harlan walked to Rosie. The girl was on her hip asleep now, head on Margaret's shoulder. Margaret's elaborate hair was down. Her expensive dress had a burn mark on the hem. She looked at Rosie without the carefully maintained expression she usually wore. "She's all right?" Rosie asked. "She's all right." Margaret's voice was not entirely steady. "Because of you." Rosie nodded. "Miss Bennett." Margaret stopped, started again. "I owe you more than a child's safety." She looked at the ground briefly, which was something Rosie had never seen her do. "I owe you a great deal more than that." "Yes," Rosie said. "You do." It was not gracious. It was not the thing a woman in her position was supposed to say to the most powerful social figure in Clover Ridge. But it was honest, and she was too tired and smoke raw and wrung out to manage anything less than honest. Margaret looked up, and then unexpectedly she gave a single short nod, the nod of a woman who had been given an honest answer and found she could respect it. She walked away with the girl. Nate found Rosie sitting on the trough edge 20 minutes later when the last of the fire line was stamped out and the wagons were clearing. "Percy Drum," he said quietly, sitting down beside her. "He came to me an hour ago, said Whitmore's man offered him $50 to say his statement was a lie." Rosie looked at him. "Did he take it?" "He told the man to go to hell and came directly to me." Nate's voice was flat. "Whitmore set the fire, Rosie. I can't prove it yet, but Percy knows who gave the order." She was quiet for a moment. "Whitmore knows the marshal is coming." "Yes." "He's trying to create chaos, discredit me, discredit the witness." She looked at the scorched ground. "If the fire had taken the settlement, he'd have blamed my bakery oven." "Probably." "He underestimated how many people would show up." "He's been underestimating you since the bread fair," Nate said. She looked at him. He was smoke-dark and tired, and had clearly ridden most of the night, and he was sitting beside her on a horse trough at sunrise after a fire, and looking at her with that expression she was still learning how to receive. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would. You were supposed to be finishing the consortium business. I finished what mattered." He was quiet for a moment. "Rosie, I gave up the consortium position 3 days ago." She turned to look at him fully. "The Kinney contract was my last drive under their arrangement," he said. "I'd been thinking about it for a while. This," he gestured at the morning around them, the smoke, the well, the people cleaning up together, made it clear. "Nate, I'm not asking you to take responsibility for that decision," he said. "I made it for my own reasons." He held her gaze. "One of the reasons was you. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But it was also because I've been moving for 15 years, and I am very tired of it. And this valley has a good spring, and the land north of your property could carry a modest herd without competing with your grazing." He paused. "Those are practical reasons." "And the impractical one," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Every road I took away from you felt like the wrong road." She looked at him. The smoke smell was in everything, and her hands hurt, and she had not slept, and the August deadline was 6 days away, and Whitmore was still out there recalculating, and none of that went away. None of it would go away quickly. But she was looking at a man who had given up a 15-year career for reasons he was honest about, practical and impractical both, and who was sitting beside her on a horse trough at sunrise, and not asking her for anything she hadn't already agreed to give. "You said you'd be here," she said. "I said I would." When the Kinney contract was done and the note was paid and Whitmore was dealt with. She held his gaze. "That conversation we were going to have." "Yes. The note isn't paid yet." "No." "And Whitmore isn't dealt with yet." "No." She looked at her bleeding hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Then get some sleep, Nate. We have a great deal of work left to do." He almost smiled, the real one, the one he usually managed before she saw it, but he was too tired to catch it in time, and she let herself see it just for a moment before they both stood up and went back to work. 6 days. The marshal was coming, Percy Drum was talking, the well was holding, and somewhere in Clover Ridge, Silas Whitmore was recalculating what he had left to lose. He was about to find out it wasn't enough. Marshal Holt arrived on a Tuesday 2 days before the August deadline, riding a gray horse and trailing a deputy who looked young enough that Rosie wondered if he'd finished growing. She had been expecting a larger man somehow. Holt was lean and unhurried with a face that had done a great deal of listening over many years and showed it. He came to her farm first, not the town, which told her something about the wire Nate had sent and how it had been worded. He sat at her kitchen table and read Percy Drum's notarized statement and the freight manifests and the assessor's records without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "Where is Drum now?" "Staying at the Kinney camp east of town," Nate said. He was standing near the window arms crossed, giving the marshal the table and the space he needed. He hasn't been in town since Whitmore's man approached him. Smart. Holt set the papers down. The land note. "You're 2 days from default." "Yes," Rosie said. "Even if I arrest Whitmore today, the note is a legal instrument. The debt is real, regardless of how it was obtained." He looked at her directly. "Do you have the money?" She had been waiting for this question since she woke up. "The Kinney contract paid out yesterday. I have $31. The note requires $42. An $11 gap. The same number that had started all of this back at the beginning of July, when the pump thread was filed, and the summer had its teeth in everything. Holt nodded slowly. "The assessor's clerk Hines, is he still in Clover Ridge?" "He hasn't left," Nate said. "But he's been visiting Whitmore's store every morning. They're talking." "I imagine they are." Holt stood. "I'll need Drum at the jailhouse by 4 o'clock this afternoon, and I'll need both of you present when I speak to Whitmore." He looked at Rosie. "Not as witnesses, as the people who built this case. You should be in the room." It was, she thought, a quietly remarkable thing to say. She nodded. "The $11, Nate said when Holt had gone. "No," she said immediately. "Rosie." "I said no, Nate. Not a gift, not a loan, not under any framing." She turned to face him. "I need to solve this myself." He was quiet for a moment. Not hurt, she had learned by now that he processed things rather than reacting to them, that the silence was thought rather than withdrawal. "Then what do you need?" he said. She had been thinking about it since before dawn. "The cooperative," she said. "Ada and Lena. There are 8 women working the baking rotation now. If each of them can sell 1 additional batch today and tomorrow at market rate, that's a 2-day production push. Yes. The oven runs hot for 2 days straight. You risk cracking the firebox." "I know the risk." He looked at her. "What do you need from me?" "Delivery," she said. "If I bake it, I need someone moving it to buyers fast. The mining camp south of the ridge, the military outpost the drovers passing through, you know all of them." He had his coat on before she finished the sentence. She sent word to Ada and Lena within the hour. By noon, there were 5 women in her kitchen sleeves, rolled the oven going at full heat, and the smell of dark rye bread filling the yard so completely that 2 passing riders stopped to ask if there was anything for sale. There was. There always was. Rosie worked beside the women and did not think about the marshal or the deadline or Whitmore's calculating eyes. She thought about water temperature and proving time and the exact moment a crust was ready, because that was the work, and the work was what she had. Ada talked while she worked the way she always did, the running commentary of a woman whose mind moved faster than silence could contain. "I told my husband this morning," she said, punching down a second rise. "I said, George, if that man takes Rosie's property, I will personally move my bread operation to Billings, and we will see how the town manages without someone to feed it." She didn't look up from the dough. "He said I was being dramatic. I said I was being accurate." Lena said without inflection, "I will come with you." Rosie looked at both of them. "Nobody's going to Billings," she said. "No," Ada agreed. "We're not. Because you're going to pay that note tomorrow, and Whitmore is going to jail, and then we're going to build a proper second oven so this never happens again." She shaped a loaf with the decisive efficiency of someone who had decided the outcome and was simply executing the steps. "I've already measured the yard." Rosie said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The second oven should go on the north side, better shade in the afternoon heat." Ada grinned without looking up. "North side it is." Yemk. Nate came back at 3 o'clock with empty saddlebags and $41. He laid it on the table in front of her and stepped back. "Military outpost took 4 dozen biscuits and paid top rate. Mining camp sent a man back with an order for next week. The drovers on the North Road bought everything I had left and asked for a regular supply arrangement." He paused. "That's 2 days of sales in 6 hours." Rosie counted the money. $41, one short. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the bread heel sitting on the corner of the table from the morning's first batch, the piece she'd set aside, out of habit, the way her mother always had a piece for the baker, a piece kept back from the selling. She picked it up, walked to the door, and called out to the road. A boy on a mule was passing Tommy Greer, 11 years old, who'd been drawing water from her well since June. He stopped when she called. "Tommy, you want to earn $1?" He was off the mule before she finished the question. She sent him to the Harlan ranch with a message and a wrapped loaf. The message was 3 sentences long. She wrote it without deliberating because she had been thinking about it for a long time, and the thinking was done. The message said, "Mrs. Harlan, I am short $1 of my land note payment due tomorrow. I am not asking for charity. I am offering you partnership in the cooperative bakery at 5% of quarterly profit in exchange for $1 today. If you are not interested, please disregard this message." Tommy came back in 40 minutes. He handed her a $1 coin and a folded piece of paper. The paper said, "I am interested. We will discuss terms when this business with Whitmore is settled. M. Harlan." And beneath that in smaller writing, "The bread you sent my granddaughter last week was the best she'd eaten. She asked me to tell you." Rosie folded the paper and put it in the tin box with the deed and the contracts and the loan agreement and the signed supply deal and the dried sage that was still on the shelf above all of it. $42, exact. She looked at Nate. He was watching her with the expression she'd stopped trying to categorize, the one that was simply him looking at her and not finding anything wrong with what he saw. "Let's go pay the note," she said. Marshal Holt arrested Grover Hines at the assessor's office at 2:30. He did it quietly, without spectacle, the way Rosie was beginning to understand that effective authority operated not loudly, but completely. Hines provided a full accounting within the hour. The fear that had been sitting on him since the council meeting had apparently been considerable, and the sight of Percy Drum's notarized statement and the freight manifests together was sufficient to convince him that loyalty to Whitmore was the more expensive option. He named 3 other properties. He named 2 other schemes. He named the exact date and method by which Whitmore had arranged for Rosie's pump mechanism to be damaged, the spring to be blocked, and the flour supply to be cut. He also named the person who had started the grass fire, not Whitmore himself. One of his hired men, a drifter named Cal Reeves, who had left Clover Ridge the morning after the fire and was currently, according to Hines, 3 counties west and moving. Holt sent a wire. Then he went to find Whitmore. Rosie and Nate were at the county assessor's office, a different clerk, nervous and cooperative when they heard the commotion from the main street. Not shouting, not gunfire, just the particular concentrated noise of a large number of people moving in the same direction for the same reason. She went to the door. Whitmore was coming up the main street in his wagon, moving with a purposefulness that seemed at first like a man going somewhere, and then resolved as Rosie watched into a man trying to leave. The wagon was loaded. She could see it from the way it sat heavy on the axle's luggage and boxes, and the document case he always carried. He had decided not to wait for the marshal. Holt was behind him, unhurried on his gray horse, and his deputy was moving parallel on the far side of the street, and Whitmore appeared not to have noticed either of them, yet his attention on the north road out of town. Rosie stepped into the street. She didn't plan it. She was standing in the door of the assessor's office, and Whitmore was driving past, and her feet moved before her mind caught up, and then she was standing in the middle of the main street of Clover Ridge with a wagon bearing down on her. Whitmore pulled the horses up hard. The wagon stopped 8 feet from where she stood. He looked down at her from the box, and for a moment, a single unguarded moment, the composure cracked entirely. What was underneath it was not the pleasant, calculating man she'd been dealing with for 2 months. What was underneath it was simply rage clean, and unadorned the rage of a man who had lost something he believed was already his. "Move aside," he said. "No," she said. "Oh, Miss Bennett." His voice had dropped to something that was not quite a whisper, but was meant for her alone. "You are one woman alone standing in a road. Whatever you think you've accomplished, you have no idea what I'm capable of when I'm not trying to be reasonable. I know exactly what you're capable of," she said. "You filed pump threads and blocked springs and set fire to dry grass near a schoolhouse full of children, and you dressed it all up in courtesy and good manners and concerned business advice." She kept her voice level. "I'm not moving." Behind the wagon, Holt's horse was walking, slow and certain. "You're nothing," Whitmore said, and now the pleasantness was completely gone, and what was left was the thing that had been operating underneath all of it. The thing that had decided a young woman alone on a valuable property was an obstacle to be managed. A desperate fat woman with a bread oven and a borrowed cowboy. "Nobody in this town will remember you in 10 years. Something in the street had gone very still, not quiet. There were people, there was noise, but the kind of stillness that happens when a crowd decides to pay attention. Rosie looked up at him. She was aware of her bleeding hands still wrapped in cloth from the fire. She was aware of the $42 in her coat pocket that she hadn't had yesterday. She was aware of the women in her kitchen who had baked through the heat alongside her, and the marshal's horse footfalls behind the wagon, and Nate somewhere to her left present, and still giving her the moment the same way he always did. "They don't need to remember me," she said. "They just need to remember that the water was always there, and the bread was always good, and when a man tried to take both, the town said no." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she stepped to the side of the road. Not away. To the side. One clear, deliberate step that said, "Not for your benefit, for mine." Holt's horse came alongside the wagon. "Mr. Whitmore," Holt said pleasantly, "I'd appreciate it if you stepped down." Whitmore looked at the marshal, at the deputy coming from the other side, at the crowd of people lining the street who were not intervening, but were watching with the focused attention of a community that had made a collective decision about who they were. He stepped down. The arrest was without drama. Holt was a professional, and Whitmore was in the end a man who had operated through paperwork and pressure and quiet threats, rather than direct violence. And that was not the skill set one needed when the marshal was standing beside you with a warrant and 40 witnesses. Percy Drum's testimony was read into the record that afternoon. Hines' accounting followed. The territorial court would take months to work through all of it, and there would be hearings and appeals and arguments over the properties and the notes and the freight contracts, because justice in 1882 was slow and imperfect and frequently exhausting. But Whitmore was in a jail cell, and Rosie walked to the county clerk's office and paid $42 against her land note exact in cash, earned by her own hands and the hands of the women who had worked beside her. The clerk stamped it, paid, and handed her the receipt, and she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and walked back out into the August afternoon. Nate was waiting outside. She handed him the receipt without speaking. He read it, folded it back the same way she had, and handed it to her. "Congratulations," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't congratulate me like it's over." She looked at the street. "There are court proceedings, the other properties. Hines will try to reduce his own sentence by minimizing the damage. Whitmore has lawyers." She paused. "This isn't finished." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him. "But this part is." "Yes." He held her gaze. "This part is." She had been running on anger and bread and $42 and the warmth of women working beside her, and now the most acute part of the crisis was over, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could immediately address. She could feel it in her knees and her shoulders and the backs of her hands. "I think," she said carefully, "I would like to have that conversation now." He was very still. "The one you mentioned," she said. "About what you're considering." "I know which one," he said quietly. "I told you I needed time," she said. "And I needed this." She gestured at the street, the clerk's office, the jail, to be resolved, or at least resolved enough. She looked at him. "It's resolved enough." He turned to face her fully. "What do you want to know?" "Not what you want," she said. "I know what you want. You've been showing me for 2 months what you want." She paused. "I want to know what you understand." He waited. "Do you understand," she said, "that my name stays on this deed, that the bakery cooperative belongs to the women who built it, including me, and no marriage changes that?" "Yes." "Do you understand that I will make decisions about this property without asking your permission because it's my property, and that I expect you to do the same with yours?" "Yes." "Do you understand that I have spent 3 years being told that I need to be managed or saved or made more acceptable, and that I cannot be with a man who thinks love means fixing what isn't broken?" "Rosie." His voice was very quiet. "I never wanted to fix you. I wanted to work beside you." He paused. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's why we're having this conversation." He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" She had known the question was coming. She had been preparing her response for 2 weeks, a careful, measured response that acknowledged what she wanted while protecting what she'd built. A response that set appropriate expectations and established clear terms. She had practiced it. What came out instead was, yes, just that. One word without the careful scaffolding she'd built around it, because he was standing in front of her in the main street of Clover Ridge, with the jail at his back and the clerk's office at hers, and $42 worth of receipts in her pocket, and he had asked her a direct question, and she had a direct answer. He didn't whoop or grab her. He just looked at her the way he'd looked at her bread in the community hall 6 weeks ago, with the settled, unperformed certainty of a man who has found what he was looking for and knows it. "I have conditions," she said. "I know. Many of them." "I assumed." "We'll need to write them down." "Your paper or mine?" She almost laughed. She caught it before it became what it wanted to become, which was something much larger than a laugh, something close to relief or joy, or the specific feeling of a hand unclenching after holding something too tightly for too long. "Mine," she said. "Obviously." They walked back toward the farm together in the August afternoon, not touching, not performing anything for the street's benefit, just walking at the same pace in the same direction, which was, Rosie thought, exactly what she wanted. They wrote the conditions at her kitchen table that evening. Her paper, her pen, both signatures. The ranch would remain in her name. The cooperative belonged to its members. Decisions about the property required her agreement. He would not manage her finances without her instruction, and she would not manage his without his. He added one condition of his own, written in his careful left-handed print. Rosie will stop equating accepting help with losing ground. She read it twice. Then she said, "That's going to be harder than the others." "I know," he said. "That's why I wrote it down." She signed it anyway. Ada came to the farm the next morning before anyone had arranged a visit, which meant someone had told her, which meant news in Clover Ridge moved at the speed of general satisfaction with a good outcome. She came with Lena and 3 other women from the cooperative, and there was a great deal of noise and some crying that everyone pretended was something else, and Ada hugged Rosie with the complete physical commitment of a woman who had decided to express her feelings and was not going to be talked out of it. "Finally," Ada said into Rosie's shoulder. "It's been 2 months, Ada." It felt longer. Ada pulled back and looked at Nate with the frank assessment of a woman evaluating a decision that affected someone she cared about. "You understand she's the stubborn kind." Nate glanced at Rosie. "I'd noticed." "And the proud kind." "That too. And she'll be right more often than you, and she'll know it, and she'll tell you." "I'm counting on it," Nate said. Ada looked at him for a moment longer. Then she gave a single decisive nod, turned back to Rosie and said, "All right, I'm going to need 3 days' notice for the wedding minimum because I intend to bake for it, and I need time." "It's not a celebration until there's Bennett bread," Lena said simply. Rosie looked at the women in her kitchen, Ada measuring counter space with her eyes, Lena already calculating the oven schedule, the others settling into the familiar movements of a shared workspace, and felt something that had been held at arm's length for a long time begin cautiously and deliberately to move closer. Margaret Harlan came to the farm that afternoon. She arrived alone without the entourage she usually traveled with, in a plain dress, rather than the structured public clothing she wore to community events. She knocked on the door, which was something she had not done the last time she'd been on this property. Rosie opened it. Margaret said, "I owe you an apology." "Yes," Rosie said, "you do." There was a silence. Margaret had the look of a woman who had rehearsed something careful and was recalibrating because the other party had not responded with the softening phrase that usually followed an acknowledgement of debt. "What I did at the fair," Margaret said, "and before the fair, and in every conversation I allowed or encouraged about you in this town, it was cruelty dressed in respectability. I told myself it was about standards. It wasn't." She paused. "It was about the fact that you reminded me of things I'd decided to ignore, and it was easier to manage you out of rooms than to examine what it meant that I wanted to." Rosie looked at her. "My granddaughter talks about you every day," Margaret said. "She tells everyone that Rosie carried her out of the smoke." Her voice controlled and even until now did something at the end of that sentence. "She's 7 years old, and she knows who you are. I'm 53, and I'm only now getting there." The apology was real. Rosie could tell the difference between performed remorse and the genuine kind, and this was the genuine kind which made it harder to hold at arm's length. "One apology," Rosie said, "doesn't change what happened. Not for me, and not for every woman in this town you made smaller so you could feel larger." Margaret met her eyes. "No," she said, "it doesn't." "Changed behavior does," Rosie said. "Over time. That's what I'm willing to offer you, the possibility of time and changed behavior being worth something." She paused. "I'm not forgiving you today. I'm telling you that the door isn't closed." Margaret nodded. Something in her face had shifted, not broken, but realigned. "That's more than I deserve." "Probably," Rosie said, "but it's what I have." She invited her in for coffee. Not warmly, not yet, but she invited her because the door not being closed was a true thing, and she did not deal in untrue things. They talked about the cooperative for an hour. Margaret's 5% partnership stake, what it meant in practical terms, how the quarterly accounting would work, what voice she would or would not have in production decisions. Margaret made 2 suggestions that were good ones, and Rosie said so plainly, and Margaret looked briefly surprised to be spoken to with that kind of directness, and then settled into it. When Margaret left, Nate came in from the yard where he had been occupied with fence measurements and the studied-in curiosity of a man who understood when to be elsewhere. "How'd it go?" he said. "Better than I expected." Rosie began clearing the cups. "She's sharper than I gave her credit for." "People usually are," he said, "when they stop performing." She looked at him. "Is that experience talking?" "Some." He leaned against the doorframe. "I spent 8 years performing competence on a trail drive and not letting anyone see when I didn't have an answer. Took me a while to figure out that the men I actually trusted were the ones who said I don't know and kept working. Like you do," she said. "Like I try to." She set the cups down and looked at him properly. This man in her doorframe, in her kitchen, in the ongoing daily texture of a life she had built alone, and was now cautiously and with clear terms and her name on every deed beginning to share. "Nate," she said. "Rosie, thank you." She held his gaze. "For the lock on the pump, and the flour, and going to Billings, and the fence, and coming back." She paused. "For all the things you did without being asked, and for stopping when I told you to, and for knowing the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me." She nodded once. Then she picked up the cups and went to wash them, and he went back to the fence measurements, and the summer afternoon moved on around them, ordinary and hard-won, and entirely theirs. The wedding was set for the last week of August under the cottonwood tree beside the well, because that was where everything had ultimately been decided. Ada baked for 3 days. Lena made something braided and elaborate that she said was traditional and refused to translate the name of. The women of the cooperative came in their work clothes because Rosie told them it was not a formal occasion, it was a celebration, and she knew the difference. The night before the wedding, Rosie sat alone at her kitchen table with the tin box open in front of her. The deed, the contracts, the loan agreement, the paid note receipt, the cooperative charter, the newspaper clipping about Whitmore's arrest, the letter from Margaret, the sage bundled dry, now that had been on her shelf since July. She took out the wedding conditions agreement, the one with both their signatures, and his left-handed note about accepting help, and read it through once. Then she folded it and put it back. Everything was in the box. Everything that mattered documented and signed and real. That was what her father had understood about paper, not that it replaced trust, but that it made trust possible because it gave you somewhere to stand when things got hard. She closed the box. Outside, the August night was cooler than the weeks before it. The drought wasn't finished. It would run until September, but the spring was flowing again, and the well was holding, and the bread was ordered 3 weeks in advance, and the note was paid. Tomorrow, she would marry a man who had offered her the specific thing she had needed most, which was not rescue, but partnership. And she had held him to that definition through 2 months of fire and fraud, and $42. And a community that was slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of difficulty, learning to reconsider what it thought it knew about a large young woman with a bread oven and a deep well and considerably more capability than anyone had bothered to check. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She slept without difficulty for the first time in 8 weeks, and when she woke, the summer morning was coming through the window in a clean way, and the starter on the shelf was alive and fragrant, and somewhere outside, Nate was doing something useful in the yard before she'd even put the kettle on. She lay still for a moment, listening to him work. Then she got up and started the fire. The wedding almost didn't happen. Not because of anything dramatic. Not fire, not fraud, not Silas Whitmore reaching from a jail cell to undo what had been done. It almost didn't happen because at 6:30 in the morning on the day she was supposed to marry Nathaniel Cole Rosalie Bennett, sat down on the edge of her bed and could not stand back up. Not physically. Physically, she was fine. She sat down, and the weight of the past 3 years descended on her all at once. Her father's funeral. The first winter alone. The pump. The bread fare. Every laugh and every sideways glance. And every morning, she had gotten up anyway, and it pressed her to the mattress with the force of something that had been waiting very patiently for a moment when she wasn't actively fighting anything. She sat there for a long time. The starter was on the shelf. The morning fire needed lighting. Ada was coming at 9 with enough food to feed 40 people, and the elaborate braided thing Lena had been working on for 2 days. The cottonwood tree had been strung with lanterns by Nate and 2 of his former ranch hands the previous evening, and she had watched from the window and felt something so large and unfamiliar that she'd had to look away. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to locate the feeling precisely the way she located problems with the pump or the oven methodically without panic, looking for the actual source rather than the symptom. What she found was this: she was afraid that she deserved it. Not afraid it would go wrong. Afraid it would go right. Afraid that the thing she had been protecting herself against wanting for 3 years was actually genuinely in front of her, and that wanting it fully meant the loss of the armor she had built to survive not having it. She was still sitting there when she heard him knock on the door. She almost didn't answer. Then she went to the door and opened it, and Nate was standing on her porch in his good shirt, not yet dressed for the ceremony, just his good shirt and his worn boots, holding 2 cups of coffee he had made on his camp stove in the yard, because he hadn't wanted to presume to use her kitchen on the morning of her wedding day. He looked at her face. He handed her one of the cups and sat down on the porch step without being invited. Which was, she had learned his way of offering presents without pressure here, but not requiring anything from here. She sat beside him. They drank coffee in the early morning, without speaking for a while. The summer was turning at its edges, barely a suggestion of September in the cooler mornings, the light coming in at a slightly different angle than it had in July. "I'm afraid," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Not of you." She looked at her cup. "Of being wrong about myself. Of having spent 3 years being certain about who I was because I didn't have anything to be uncertain about. And now I do, and I don't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a moment. "What were you certain about?" "That I was sufficient," she said. "Alone. That I didn't need—" She stopped. "I built something real, by myself. And it's real. The well, the cooperative, the contracts. That's real." "Yes," he said. "It is. I don't want getting married to mean that I needed you to make it real." "It doesn't," he said. "What you built. I hauled flour and fixed fence. That's not the same thing." She looked at him. "Rosie." He set down his cup and turned to face her with the directness that she'd understood from the first morning as his actual language, not the evasion or the performance that most people substituted for honesty, but the thing itself. "You are the most sufficient person I have ever met. You were sufficient before I arrived, and you will be sufficient if I'm gone tomorrow. That is not what today is about." "Then what is it about?" "It's about two sufficient people deciding they'd rather be in the same place." A pause. "That's all. Nothing you built changes. Nothing you are changes. You just have someone in the yard when you come out in the morning." She looked at him for a long time. "Someone who makes bad coffee," she said. He looked at the cup. "It's not that bad." "It is genuinely that bad." The corner of his mouth moved. "You could teach me." She felt something in her chest release. Not collapse, not dissolve, but release the way a fist releases when it's been holding something long enough and finally trusts the surface beneath. She felt it go, and she let it go, and what was left wasn't emptiness. It was room. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you how to do it right." He came inside. She showed him the coffee, the grind, and the water temperature, and the timing, the things her mother had taught her that she had never thought to teach anyone else, because there had never been anyone to teach. He paid attention the way he paid attention to everything completely, without performing the attention, just genuinely receiving it. When it was done, and they both had better coffee, she looked at him across her kitchen table and said, "All right." He said, "All right." They got married at noon. Ada cried through the entire ceremony and blamed pollen. Lena did not cry, but gripped the arm of the woman beside her with a pressure that left marks. Tommy Greer, who had delivered Margaret's dollar and her letter, and apparently decided this made him personally invested in the outcome, stood in the front row with his hat held correctly in both hands and a seriousness that was genuinely touching. Margaret Harlan came. She sat in the back and did not attempt to manage anything, which was for her an act of considerable discipline. The vows were short because Rosie had written them, and she did not believe in saying things at length that could be said precisely. She promised to work honestly, to speak plainly, and to stop confusing independence with isolation. He promised to work beside her, to ask before deciding, and to remember every day that she had been whole before he arrived. When the minister said he could kiss his bride, Nate looked at her, first actually looked at her, a question, and she gave him the slight nod that was all the permission either of them needed, and it was tender and brief and utterly without performance, witnessed by 40 people who had the good sense to understand what they were seeing. Ada started crying again immediately. The bread was extraordinary. Of course it was. 3 years passed, the way good years pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but fully. Each season pressed against the next with the weight of real life in them. The Whitmore trial ran for 4 months in the territorial court at Billings. Rosie attended every day she could manage with the tin box and its documents and testified twice, and the second time, the opposing lawyer asked her about the note payment. She read from the receipt in a voice that carried to the back of the room and didn't look at him once. Whitmore was convicted on 7 counts of fraud and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy. Hines received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. Cal Reeves, The man who had started the grass fire was apprehended 3 counties west, exactly where Hines had said he'd be. The 3 properties that had been taken through the same scheme, the Halverson widow, the Murtaugh brothers' Emmett Price, were the subject of a separate civil proceeding that ran another 8 months. The outcomes were imperfect, the way legal outcomes in 1882 generally were not. Everyone got back everything that had been taken, but the Halverson widow got her land back, and the Murtaughs reached a settlement, and Emmett Price got his creek rights restored, which was what mattered most to him. Rosie appeared as a witness in those proceedings too. She had become, without quite intending it, the person people called when a document needed reading or a timeline needed establishing. She didn't mind. She was good at it. The cooperative grew. By the end of the first year, 8 women were drawing regular wages from it. By the end of the second, there were 14. The second oven went up on the north side of the yard, exactly as Ada had announced it would, and then a third the following spring, because the military outpost contract doubled and the mining camp sent a standing order that required more capacity than 2 ovens could handle. Ada ran the scheduling. Lena trained new bakers with a patience and precision that turned out to be extraordinary. A woman named Dorothea, who had come to Clover Ridge with her husband's cattle outfit and stayed when he didn't turn out to have a gift for dried goods and preserved foods that expanded the cooperative's offerings beyond bread entirely. Rosie named it Bennett Trail Provisions. The name was her father's name, and her mother's work, and her own survival, and it said everything she wanted to say. She and Nate had settled into a partnership that looked from the outside like a practical working arrangement, and was from the inside something she had no adequate word for, except exactly right. He ran a modest herd on the North Grassland, came home each evening, knew when to talk and when to be quiet, made coffee that had improved considerably under instruction, and never once, not in 3 years, made her feel that the size of her body was the most important thing about her. That last thing was not a small thing. She knew it was not a small thing. She had spent most of her adult life managing the way the world responded to her body, the looks, the comments, the pity, and the cruelty that operated as 2 sides of the same dismissal. She had built her self-sufficiency partly as armor against it, a way of insisting that her value existed regardless of whether anyone assigned it. With Nate, she had learned slowly, with considerable resistance, that it was possible to be valued and still be herself. That accepting love was not the same as depending on it. That a man who looked at her and saw a person rather than a problem to overlook or a body to explain away was not performing something for her benefit. He was simply telling the truth. She had stopped arguing with the truth. It took about 14 months. She thought that was reasonable. Their daughter came in the second year, small, loud, and absolutely certain of her own opinions from approximately the first week. They named her Clara, which had not been planned, but arrived in the room when Nate held her, and looked at his wife and said the name, and Rosie said yes, before she'd entirely decided to. Clara had her mother's gray-blue eyes and her father's patience, which was a combination that would probably be difficult to argue with in about 15 years. Ada declared her perfect. Lena knitted something in 3 colors in a single afternoon. Margaret Harlan came to the farm with a gift so practical and well-chosen that it revised Rosie's estimate of her upward for the 3rd time. Margaret had changed. Not transformed, not converted into someone other than herself, but changed in the specific way of a person who has examined a long-held assumption and found it wanting and done the work of revising it. She was still formidable, still the most organized woman in Clover Ridge, still capable of managing a room without appearing to try. But she had stopped using those skills to diminish, and started sometimes awkwardly and sometimes with genuine grace to use them alongside people rather than over them. She became a reliable advocate for the cooperative in town council meetings, which required very little grace and a great deal of formidability, and she was extraordinarily good at it. Rosie did not forget what Margaret had done, but she found to her own surprise that watching someone actually change their behavior over time was a different experience from receiving an apology, and it generated something different in her. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but a kind of careful regard that had room to grow. She told Nate this one evening. He listened, thought about it, and said, Is that what changed behavior looks like over time? I think so, she said. Good, he said. Then I'll keep doing it. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. Jid. The summer provision fair came around again in July of the third year. The same community hall, the same long tables, and the same careful arrangements of the women who had been arranging things in Clover Ridge for as long as anyone could remember. The town looked different than it had 3 years ago. Not physically, the buildings were the same, the streets were the same. But in the way a community looks when something has shifted in its internal accounting of who counted and who didn't. The cooperative had a table at the fair now which it had not had 3 years ago. Nobody had suggested it. It had simply appeared as a natural consequence of the cooperative being the largest food producer in the valley, and the fair committee having eventually noticed this. Ada had decorated the table with more enthusiasm than Rosie thought was strictly necessary, but the result was impressive, and Rosie did not say so because Ada would take 3 minutes to be pleased and then redirect it into productivity, which was exactly how she operated. Rosie was standing behind the table with Clara on her hip, 14 months old, extremely interested in the bread, reaching for it, with the focused determination of a person who had recently discovered opinions when she heard the conversation at the door. A young woman had come in carrying a loaf wrapped in a plain cloth. She was perhaps 20 slight, with the watchful look of someone who had grown up reading rooms for signs of welcome or the lack of it. She was holding the loaf with both hands and looking at the judging table with an expression that Rosie recognized from the inside. She recognized it because she had worn it 3 years ago. In this room, the woman at the table registration. Not Margaret, not Clara Finch, who had moved away, but a younger woman who had appointed herself to the role with more confidence than knowledge, looked at the loaf and said with the tone of someone applying a rule they'd been taught, rather than one they'd thought about. The table is already at capacity, I'm afraid. Perhaps next... Excuse me, Rosie said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. 3 years of running a cooperative, testifying in court, and speaking at town council meetings had given her voice a quality that turned heads without requiring volume. The registration woman turned. Rosie shifted Clara to her other hip, crossed to the young woman with the bread, and held out her hand. May I? The young woman looked at her with the specific caution of someone who has been offered things that turned out not to be offers. Rosie held her gaze steadily until the wariness found something in Rosie's face that it could decide to trust, and the loaf was handed over. Rosie unwrapped it, dark dense with a crust that had been scored with a pattern she didn't recognize. Regional, she thought, or family. The mark of a tradition the baker had brought from somewhere else. She broke off a corner and tasted it. The room was doing the thing that rooms in Clover Ridge did when Rosalie Cole, she had taken his name for public business, a decision she'd made on her own terms, was paying attention to something. A specific settling, a realignment of focus. The bread was good, more than good. It was made with a starter that had been maintained a long time, fed with care, allowed to develop the complexity that came from patience rather than speed. What flour? Rosie asked. Mixed, the young woman said carefully. Half rye, half wheat. The wheat is local, but the rye I had to order special. The starter is... She paused. It was my grandmother's. She brought it from Sweden. How old? 30 years. Rosie looked at the bread in her hand. 30 years. Fed through a transatlantic crossing, through an immigrant life in a new country, through whatever had brought this young woman to a provision fair in Montana, with a loaf that nobody at the registration table knew how to categorize. What's your name? Rosie asked. Ingrid Strand. Miss Strand. Rosie handed the loaf back to her, moved to the judging table, shifted 3 arrangements and made a space. Put it here. The registration woman began. Mrs. Cole, the judges have already... The judges, Rosie said pleasantly, can taste it and decide. That's what judges are for. She set Clara down on the table beside the bread because there was nowhere else to put her, and Clara immediately attempted to eat the edge of the nearest tablecloth, which required a brief intervention, and by the time that was resolved, Ingrid Strand had placed her loaf in the space Rosie had made, and nobody was arguing about it anymore. Ada materialized from somewhere to Rosie's left. She looked at the bread. looked at Ingrid, looked at Rosie, with the expression of a woman who had been present for a great deal of this story and recognized the shape of a new chapter. "Can you bake in quantity?" Ada asked Ingrid. Ingrid blinked. Yes. I've been supplying 3 households since spring. Mixed rye and wheat is interesting for the trail orders," Ada said, already thinking ahead the way she always was. "The texture holds differently in the heat, if we can test it over 2 weeks." She looked at Rosie. "What do you think?" "I think Miss Strand should talk to Lena," Rosie said. "Lena will know if the fermentation process is compatible." Ingrid was looking between them with the disoriented expression of someone who came to a bread fair expecting rejection and appears to have wandered into a job interview. What are you?" "Bennett Trail Provisions," Ada said. "We're a cooperative. We pay fair wages, provide oven access, and hold quarterly profit shares." She produced a card from her apron pocket. Rosie had made Ada get cards printed in the spring, a decision Ada had initially resisted and now deployed constantly. "Come find us after the judging." Ingrid took the card. Rosie picked up Clara, who had been expressing opinions about the tablecloth situation, and turned back toward the cooperative table. Nate was in the doorway. He had not been there a moment ago. He had arrived the way he often arrived in crowded spaces, quietly taking in the situation before deciding whether to enter it. And he was holding his hat in both hands and watching her with the expression that was, after 3 years, still the same expression. Not performance. Not the heightened attention of a man proving something. Just a man looking at his wife the way he'd looked at her bread in this same room 3 years ago, with the steady, unperformed certainty of someone who knew what they were looking at and was not confused about its value. Clara saw him and made a sound of focused enthusiasm that was approximately his name. He came forward, took Clara from her arms with the practiced ease of a man who had done this thousands of times in 14 months, settled her against his shoulder, and looked at Rosie. "You found another one," he said. "The bread is good." "It always is," he said, "when you find it." She looked at him. Clara patted his hat, apparently testing its structural integrity. "Still?" she asked. He looked at her with that expression that had not changed in 3 years, that she had stopped trying to manage or question or hold at arm's length because she had finally accepted that it was simply true. "Every day," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." She had said yes to that once in writing with conditions and signatures. She said it again now with a look that needed no documentation. Clara retrieved his hat successfully and placed it on her own head, where it covered her face entirely. That evening after the fair, after Ingrid Strand had spoken with Lena for 45 minutes and left with a trial arrangement and a starter culture that Lena had divided from her own, after Ada had tallied the day's sales and declared it the cooperative's best quarter opening in 3 years, after the lanterns had been taken down and the tables cleared, and Clara had fallen asleep in the wagon on the way home, Rosie sat on the porch of the house her father had built and her mother had kept, and she had nearly lost and chosen to save, and she cut the last heel of the morning's bread and ate it. Nate brought her coffee. It was good. It had been good for over a year. He sat beside her. The September night was cool and full of stars, the kind of sky that Montana produced when it wasn't trying to kill anything and was simply existing, vast and extravagant and entirely indifferent to human opinion. "Ingrid Strand's starter," Rosie said. 30 years old. Older than her. Older than me. She looked at the bread in her hand. Her grandmother fed it on a ship crossing the Atlantic. Probably didn't know anyone where she was going. Probably had very little that was hers. She paused. But she kept the starter. Nate was quiet. "Because it was alive," Rosie said. "And alive, things are worth keeping." He looked at her. "Is that what you were thinking about?" he said, "when you made room at the table?" "I was thinking about a lot of things." She finished the bread. "I was thinking about Margaret telling me the table was full, and about you eating my bread in front of everyone when no one else would touch it." She looked at him. "And about what it cost me to walk into that room, and what it cost you nothing, and how those two different costs are the thing this entire town has been arguing about for 3 years without quite using those words. He listened. He was a man who listened the way some people looked with his entire attention. "The table isn't full," she said. "It was never full. There was always room. They were just deciding who deserved to take up space." She paused. "I want Clara to grow up in a town where that decision has already been made differently." "She will," Nate said. "You're making it differently, every day." Rosie looked at the well across the yard. Dark now, just the lock glinting in the starlight. The same lock he'd put there in July 3 years ago, the first gift he'd ever given her, practical and silent, and given before she knew to want it. "I never said thank you for the lock," she said. He looked at her. "You're saying it now." "I'm saying it now." She held his gaze. "It was the right thing at the right time. I didn't know what to make of you yet, so I didn't acknowledge it. But it mattered." She paused. "You mattered. Before I was willing to say so." He set down his coffee cup and took her hand, which still had the small scars on the knuckles from the fence rail she'd pulled apart on the night of the fire. He had never commented on those scars. He simply knew where they were, and occasionally, without remarking on it, held her hand with them in mind. "I knew," he said quietly. "That's why I kept coming back." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stars, and he turned back to the stars, and they sat together in the September night on the porch of a house that was hers, on land that was hers in a life that was hers, and was also on terms she had negotiated with care and signed with her own name, theirs. The well held. The bread was good. The starter on the shelf was over 11 years old now. Still alive, still working, still turning simple things into something that could sustain people through hard seasons. Some things, if you fed them honestly and protected them from what would diminish them, lasted. Rosalie Bennett Cole had learned that the hard way. She had learned it with flour on her hands and a deed in a tin box, and $42 she had earned herself, and she intended to spend the rest of her life knowing it. The night was quiet. Clara slept in the house behind them. The starter worked in the dark. And in the whole wide territory of Montana, there was not a single table she would be turned away from. Not anymore. Some people are overlooked because they do not fit the shape the world has chosen for beauty or success or respectability. But worth does not disappear because a crowd refuses to recognize it. Real love does more than defend someone from cruelty. It sees their strength, respects their labor, and stands beside them while they build a life of their own choosing. Rosie was not saved because a handsome cowboy selected her. She saved her land, fed her neighbors, exposed a corrupt man, and changed the rules of her community. Nate's greatest act of love was not choosing her bread. It was understanding that she already had a home, a purpose, and a future, and asking quietly whether he could help build them with her. She said yes, and she meant it on her own terms. That was always the only way she knew how.